Hello, everybody. Welcome to another GYN Garage, where we talk about how nice the weather is in both places that we are in. I'm in Lexington, Kentucky, where the weather has been beautiful in the mid 70s. My colleague today is,
Frank Lawton in London, and you can probably see from the sunshine that it's coming through my study window. It's very warm, very, very pleasant indeed. A very atypical English summer, but to be enjoyed while it lasts.
well, Frank, is Prime Minister Burnham going to lower the cost of living? Will he support AC for the UK? And will he
Well,
lower
like
that
all
scale?
politicians, they promise something. I mean, he's going to. Oh, he said that he will reduce VAT, value-added tax, on electricity bills from 5% to 0% for 6 months. Now, if you look actually at the cost of energy in the UK is very expensive compared with Europe and probably the rest of the world. But electricity prices really have not changed at all. Gas prices have changed dramatically with the Gulf conflict, but electricity prices haven't. So actually to reduce the cost of electricity, but not the cost of gas, probably is just a politician saying something in order to get popularity and get votes. A pound a week is what is going to at the average household, a pound a week. So for 6 months, that's 26 quid. They're not saving a lot of money in a year. You got to start somewhere.
That's absolutely true. Well, we're going to start today by considering the question, are there any differences in long-term HPV incidence or cervical cancer recurrence between cervical cold knife conization or loop electrosurgical excision? Answer to this question is approached in a paper titled Long-Term Outcomes After Surgical Cold Knife Conization or Loop Electrosurgical Excision Procedures. This paper was recently published in JAMA Surgery. Frank, have at it.
Okay. Well, some years ago, Pierre Martin Hirsch in the UK produced a Cochrane report looking at the results of randomized trials of loop diathermy, LEAP or LETS, whatever it's going to be called, versus cone, and really didn't produce any data that suggested there was any adverse effect of one against the other. This group said that one of the weaknesses of that study is that they only looked at randomized studies, which I don't think is a weakness, but also short-term or recurrence of abnormalities. So this group have looked at two aspects of loop diathermy versus cone, the recurrence rate and the HPV clearance. And they've looked at two cohorts which are quite disparate, and they do admit this, but they've tried, I think, quite hard in order to amalgamate the studies to make the results understandable. So in Sweden, where the majority of cases were, loop diathermy is the treatment of choice. In China, where the group was based, it's either traditional cone biopsy or loop diathermy. And the group have used what's called a hypothetical target trial, and I had to find out what this really meant. And this is basically using observational data in order to uh, determine whether there's causal inference from observed data. So it's as good as a randomized trial, but it's not a randomized trial. So if we look first at HPV clearance, the results are actually pretty similar, but they are statistically better for the patients who underwent cone biopsy. The HPV clearance was measured at 3, 6, and 12 months. Just for example, that the cone biopsy at 6 months, 90% were HPV free compared with 82% HPV free if they'd had loop diathermy. So although the majority of patients were HPV negative at 3, 6, and 12 months, the results do suggest that there is an advantage from cone biopsy. From a recurrence point of view, this is where I think that the data are difficult to accept, but the group does admit that there is this quite marked discrepancy. In Europe, the recurrence rate was 21%, whether it was loop diathermy or cone. But in China, the recurrence rate for loop diathermy was 1.8% and for cone 0.8%. So they've tried to make amends for this, and I understand that. But I think looking at those data, there's something dramatically different between the recurrence rates in the Swedish data and the recurrence rates in the Chinese data. And I don't know whether or not this study is strong enough to determine about that. So I think we've got the results there. One thing that always annoys me about some studies is that they put data into a supplement, and the HPV data, the HPV cleanse, is in a supplement, and when actually it could be in a table. That's quite important. The tables contain all sorts of data about age and ethnicity and all sorts of things, which really are not particularly relevant. That could be in the supplement. The more important thing, I think, is HPV clearance. So if we look at the margins, for instance, which is quite important, I think from a point of view of recurrence, its margins are probably important. In the Chinese data, because they could compare cone and loop diathermy, the positive margins in the loop data were 3.5%, but cone 12.5%. So you'd imagine that the cone data is actually going to show not as good as the leap data. 12.5% positive margins. They don't say whether the margin is on the ectocervix or the endocervix, which I think is actually a mistake, or it's an omission in the paper. That would be more important. Recurrence rates of in the Swedish data, as I said, 21% compared with 1.1, 1.8 or 0.8% in the Chinese data. There's something there. The other thing I think is that because it's long-term data, I think the Swedish data was over something like a 20-year period, whereas the Chinese data was over a 9-year period. Are these recurrences or are these new lesions? And we don't know the history of these patients, their sexual history after loop diathermy. We don't know whether or not they received HPV vaccines. We don't know, we don't even know when the recurrence occurred. It just says there has been a recurrence during this follow-up period. I think a recurrence, a further abnormality at 5 years is probably more likely to be a new lesion rather than recurrence of an old lesion. And I think also the protocols that are slightly different. The Swedish protocol says a cone biopsy for glandular lesions or for high-grade disease. So that may well affect the data that that's been presented. And I think the other covariates that they haven't looked at smoking, sexual history, number of sexual partners. Also, they haven't determined whether or not they're associated vulval lesions, HPV-associated vulval lesions. So I think in general, the paper is interesting. It does suggest that there is possibly an advantage of one treatment modality over the other. I think it's at odds with the Cochrane data that has shown randomized studies, but I think they've admitted the weaknesses very much of this study. It's a pity that there are certain things that they haven't looked at, such as the margins and when the disease recurs. But otherwise, I think it's quite an interesting paper, and it should engender further research, I think.
To what extent, Frank, do you think that the non-physicians, the non-surgeons who get involved in making these decisions between LEAP and cold knife are going to object to this paper?
Yes, I don't think non-physicians will. I think that people looking at this will just say, look, here are two modalities that treat women with abdominal smears. One seems to have fewer problems than another. And I think probably statisticians will love it because they've taken a very large database and produced some possible causal reasons. I think from a clinician's point of view, because of what I've mentioned, I think the data that are missing, I think clinicians are going to say, yeah, that's fine, but what about what I've been talking about? I think the data are interesting, and I think it could have been a much better paper if they'd been able to get data such as margins and time of relapse, which I think, and also the other risk factors, which they've not been able to.
If you saw two surgeons talking on the corner and this topic came up, and one said, well, I believe we've got to do cold knife. And the other one said, no, I don't think we have to. I think both positions would be defensible.
They would, but if you look at the Cochrane data that looks at randomized studies, then there's no argument for one against the other. So I think you're absolutely right. But of course, then there's the fact that most cone biopsies will be done under general anesthetic. They're possibly a larger lesion, require further more excision of the transformation zone, have more complications with bleeding, stenosis, fertility, etc. So I think if the two are very similar in outcome, then do as little as possible, particularly if patients get recurrent disease and you're thinking of retreating them. If they've already had a cone biopsy and these are young women and they get a recurrence and you think, well, cone biopsy is the treatment modality for me, you're removing a large amount of cervix, of transformation zone. So I think I agree they can both be defended, but I think if you're going to, and these data are actually looking at long-term data. I think if you're looking at the long term, you've got to accept what might happen if and when the disease recurs. And if they've already had a cone, that could well be a problem.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've done another one. Now all I have to do is look forward to next month. I see the
Yep,
sun breaking through on your shoulder. You,
it looks fabulous, doesn't it? Yeah,
yeah,
look
it
at that.
does. It looks great.
Yep.
Okay, well, go out and enjoy. Well, enjoy dinner first, but I'll see you in a month, Frank.
Okay, nice to speak to you, Ed. Take care.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye bye.